I was fixing fence posts when my phone rang that Tuesday morning. The caller ID showed Jake's number, but something in his voice told me this wasn't about borrowing tools or asking about cattle prices. Our father was dead. Heart attack, Jake said. Found him in the barn that morning, slumped over a feed bucket like he'd just stopped to rest. 68 years old, and Dad had worked every single day since he was 14. The ranch was his life, his legacy, everything he'd built from nothing but determination and calloused hands. I dropped the post-hole digger and stared across our family's land, 3,000 acres of Texas hill country that had been in our family for 3 generations. Dad always said this place would outlive us all, that the land remembers everything even when people forget. The funeral was set for Friday. Jake handled the arrangements while I drove the 8 hours from Austin, where I'd been working construction jobs and trying to forget why I'd left home 15 years ago. The city had been my escape, but now it felt like running away from something I should have faced long ago. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, memories hit me like a physical blow. Dad teaching me to rope cattle, showing me how to read the weather in the clouds, explaining that respect was earned through work, not words. He'd been disappointed when I left for college, devastated when I never came back to help run the ranch. Jake had stayed. Jake had been the dutiful son, the one who learned every aspect of the business, who married a local girl and gave Dad the grandchildren he'd wanted. Jake was everything I wasn't, but as I stood in that familiar driveway, breathing in the scent of hay and dust, I wondered if coming home might finally give me the chance to make things right with the old man's memory. The funeral drew half the county. Dad had been respected, even loved, by people who understood what it meant to work the land honestly. Ranchers, feed store owners, veterinarians, and neighbors who'd known our family for decades came to pay their respects. I stood beside Jake at the graveside, both of us wearing our best boots and the only suits we owned. Jake's wife, Sarah, held their twin boys, 8 years old, and already showing signs of inheriting the family's stubborn streak. Dad would have been proud to see them growing up on the same land where he'd raised us. The preacher spoke about legacy, about how a man's true worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives he touches and the values he passes down. I thought about all the conversations Dad and I never had, all the times I'd been too proud to call home, too afraid of his disappointment to bridge the gap between us. After the service, people shared stories. How Dad had helped during the drought of '08, lending equipment and expertise to struggling neighbors. How he'd quietly paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford them. How he'd taught dozens of young men the skills they needed to make honest livings. Jake seemed to know every story, had been part of most of them. I realized how much of Dad's life I'd missed, how many moments of pride and community I'd traded for the anonymity of city living. That evening, Jake and I sat on the porch, where we'd spent countless summer nights as kids, drinking beer and watching the sunset paint the hills gold and purple. For the first time in years, we talked like brothers instead of strangers. "He missed you," Jake said quietly. "Never stopped talking about you, wondering what you were building in Austin, whether you were happy." The words hit harder than any accusation could have. Monday morning brought us to the law office of Henderson and Associates, a modest building on Main Street that had handled our family's legal affairs for 30 years. Mr. Henderson himself had drawn up Dad's will, knew every detail of the ranch's operation and our family's complicated dynamics. Jake arrived first, as usual. He sat in the leather chair across from Henderson's desk, looking comfortable and confident. Sarah had stayed home with the boys, but Jake's presence filled the room with the quiet authority he'd developed over years of managing ranch operations. I felt out of place in my city clothes, like an outsider intruding on family business. Henderson greeted me warmly, but I could see the questions in his eyes. Why had I stayed away so long? What right did I have to be here now? The will began predictably. Dad had been methodical about everything, and his final wishes reflected the same careful planning he'd brought to breeding cattle and managing pastures. Small bequests to longtime employees, donations to the church and local 4-H chapter, specific instructions about maintaining the family cemetery. Then Henderson reached the main provisions, the ranch itself. All 3,000 acres plus equipment, livestock and buildings would be divided between Jake and me. Equal shares, despite my years of absence, despite Jake's dedication and sacrifice. I stared at Henderson stunned. Jake's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, with what I recognized as barely controlled anger. This wasn't what either of us had expected. "There's more," Henderson said, his voice careful and professional. He pulled out a second document, newer than the will, dated just 6 months ago. "Your father filed this amendment after his last doctor's visit. He wanted to ensure both sons understood his intentions. The amendment changed everything. It specified that while we'd inherit equally, the ranch could only be sold if both brothers agreed. If one wanted to keep it, he could buy out the other at fair market value. Dad had found a way to bring us back together, whether we wanted it or not." That night, Jake and I met at Murphy's Bar, the same place where we'd celebrated our 21st birthdays and argued about everything from politics to football. The conversation started carefully, both of us dancing around the obvious tension. "I don't understand it," Jake said, staring into his beer. 30 years I've worked this place. 30 years of getting up before dawn, dealing with sick cattle, fixing equipment, managing books. You left for college and never looked back." I couldn't argue with his facts. Jake had sacrificed his youth for the ranch, while I'd pursued my own dreams. He'd married young, started a family, built his entire life around continuing Dad's legacy. I'd sent Christmas cards and made excuses about why I couldn't visit. "Maybe that's exactly why he did it," I said. "Maybe he knew you'd never leave, never consider selling. Maybe he wanted to make sure I had a reason to come home." Jake's laugh was bitter. "So I get punished for loyalty? I get to watch my inheritance get split with someone who couldn't be bothered to visit his dying father?" The words stung because they were true. I'd known Dad was slowing down, had heard about his heart problems from mutual friends, but I'd convinced myself he was invincible, that there would always be time to make things right. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Jake was quiet for a long time, rolling his beer bottle between his palms. "I want to buy you out. This place is my life, my kids' future. I can get a loan, maybe sell some of the back acreage to cover your half." It was the logical solution. Jake would keep the ranch he'd earned through decades of work, and I'd get enough money to start fresh somewhere else, clean, simple, fair. But something in Dad's careful planning made me hesitate. Why had he structured it this way if he'd wanted Jake to have everything? I spent the next few days walking the ranch, reacquainting myself with land I'd once known like my own heartbeat. The old swimming hole where Jake and I had spent summer afternoons, the pasture where Dad had taught me to drive his ancient pickup truck, the barn where he'd shown me how to deliver a calf, his hands gentle and sure as he guided new life into the world. Every corner held memories, and slowly I began to understand what I'd lost by staying away. This wasn't just land or livestock or a business operation. This was home in the deepest sense, the place that had shaped everything I was, even if I'd spent years trying to forget it. Jake found me sitting on the porch steps Wednesday evening, watching the cattle move slowly across the pasture in the fading light. He looked exhausted, older than his 42 years. "Sarah thinks I should just accept the partnership," he said, settling beside me. "She says maybe Dad knew what he was doing. Maybe he wanted both his sons involved in keeping this place going." I could hear the conflict in his voice. Jake had always been the practical one, the brother who thought through problems methodically, but this situation defied practical solutions. "What do you think?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching a red-winged blackbird perch on a fence post. I think Dad was smarter than either of us gave him credit for. I think he knew exactly what would happen if he left everything to me. You'd disappear again, and I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd stolen something that should have been shared. It was the most honest thing either of us had said since the funeral. Jake had always carried guilt about being the favored son, just as I'd carried resentment about being the one who left. And if he'd left everything to you, Jake continued, I'd have spent my life bitter about wasting 30 years on something that wasn't really mine. Dad's wisdom was becoming clearer. He'd found a way to force us to confront our relationship, to work together or lose everything he'd built. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Tom Bradley, who owned the neighboring ranch, arrived with his son Mike and a folder full of documents. Tom had been Dad's closest friend for 40 years, and his weathered face showed genuine concern. "Boys, I heard about your situation," Tom said, settling into a kitchen chair that creaked under his weight. "Wanted to talk to you about something that might matter." He spread papers across the table, geological surveys, mineral rights assessments, and correspondence with energy companies. The documents painted a picture I hadn't expected. "Your daddy knew this land sits on one of the biggest shale formations in the county," Tom explained. "Oil companies have been sniffing around for 5 years, making offers that would set both your families up for life." Jake stared at the papers, his face unreadable. "Dad never mentioned any of this." "He was protecting it," Tom said. "Knew that if word got out, you'd have every speculator in Texas trying to buy you out or lease your mineral rights for pennies on the dollar. But he also knew that someday you boys might need options." The implications were staggering. The ranch wasn't just 3,000 acres of cattle country. It was potentially worth millions in oil and gas rights. Dad had been sitting on a fortune while living modestly, planning carefully, protecting his son's future in ways we'd never imagined. Mike Bradley, who'd studied petroleum engineering at A&M, explained the technical details. The formation was deep but accessible, the geology favorable for horizontal drilling. Conservative estimates suggested enough reserves to generate substantial royalty income for decades. "The question is," Tom said, "what do you boys want to do with this information? Your daddy trusted me to share it when the time was right. I think that time is now." Jake and I looked at each other across the table, both of us realizing that Dad's will had been even more carefully crafted than we'd understood. That afternoon, Jake and I drove to the back 40, the section of ranch land that had always been considered the least valuable. Rocky, difficult to graze, too far from water sources to be useful for much besides hunting. Now, we looked at it with different eyes. "He knew," Jake said, kicking at the limestone outcropping that marked the property line. "All those years he talked about this land being worthless, he knew exactly what was underneath." I thought about Dad's careful financial planning. His insistence on paying off the ranch mortgage early, his reluctance to take on debt even when cattle prices were high. He'd been preparing for something bigger than either of us had realized. "The question is," I said, "what do we do now?" Jake was quiet for a long time, staring across the rolling hills that had defined our childhood. "We could lease the mineral rights, keep ranching, and have enough income to modernize everything. New equipment, better facilities, maybe even expand the operation." It was a tempting vision. The ranch could become everything Dad had dreamed of. A showplace operation that combined tradition with modern efficiency. But it would also mean accepting a partnership neither of us had planned for. "Or we could sell everything," I said, "split the money and go our separate ways." Jake's face tightened. "Is that what you want?" I looked across the land where 3 generations of our family had worked and lived and died. The answer surprised me. "No, I don't think it is." For the first time since the funeral, Jake smiled. Dad would be laughing his ass off right now. He figured out how to get both his stubborn sons exactly where he wanted them. The sun was setting. painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no city sunset could match. In the distance, cattle moved slowly toward the water tank, following patterns established by instinct and generations of careful breeding. "Partners?" Jake asked, extending his hand. I shook it, feeling the calluses that marked 30 years of honest work. Partners. The next few weeks blurred together in a whirlwind of legal consultations, financial planning, and difficult conversations about the future. Jake and I met with petroleum engineers, environmental consultants, and tax attorneys, learning the complex realities of mineral rights and energy development. The offers from oil companies were substantial, but Tom Bradley's advice proved invaluable. Instead of selling our rights outright, we negotiated lease agreements that would provide steady royalty income while maintaining our ownership of the land. The initial signing bonus alone would be enough to modernize the entire ranch operation. Sarah proved to be a natural at the business side of planning. Her background in accounting, combined with her practical understanding of ranch life, made her an essential part of our decision-making process. She helped us structure the partnership in ways that protected both families while allowing for growth and expansion. I found myself staying in Dad's old room, surrounded by the books and papers that had guided his decisions for decades. Ranch journals dating back 40 years, breeding records that tracked bloodlines through multiple generations, financial records that showed his careful stewardship of every dollar. One evening, I discovered a letter addressed to both Jake and me, tucked inside Dad's copy of a cattle breeding manual. His handwriting was shaky but determined, dated just a month before his death. "Boys," it began, "if you're reading this, then Henderson has done his job and you're both trying to figure out what the hell I was thinking. The truth is, I was thinking about legacy, not just the land, but the family that works it." The letter went on to explain his reasoning, his hopes for our partnership, and his quiet pride in both his sons. He'd known about my construction business in Austin, had followed my work through mutual friends. He'd also seen Jake's dedication and sacrifice, his natural leadership, and deep love for the ranch. "Jake, you've earned this place 10 times over," the letter continued, "but you've also earned the right to share it with your brother, to show him what you've built and learned. And son, you've earned the right to come home without shame or apology." Spring brought new challenges and unexpected rewards. Jake and I worked together for the first time since we were teenagers, and the learning curve was steep for both of us. I had to reacquaint myself with cattle behavior, equipment maintenance, and the 1,000 small decisions that kept a ranch operation running smoothly. Jake had to learn to delegate, to trust someone else with responsibilities he'd handled alone for years. It wasn't easy for either of us, but gradually we found our rhythm. The oil company began preliminary work on the back 40, setting up access roads and drilling sites with minimal impact on the grazing land. The royalty payments started flowing in, providing the financial security that allowed us to make long-term improvements. We invested in new breeding stock, upgraded the water system, and built modern facilities that would improve efficiency while maintaining the ranch's traditional character. Jake's boys, Tommy and Jake Jr., threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm that reminded me of our own childhood. I found myself thinking about Dad constantly during those first months. Every decision we made, every problem we solved, seemed to echo lessons he'd taught us years ago. His presence was strongest in the early morning hours when Jake and I would meet in the kitchen before dawn to plan the day's work over coffee and Sarah's homemade biscuits. The partnership wasn't without friction. Jake and I had different ideas about everything from cattle breeds to equipment purchases, and we had to learn to compromise on decisions that affected both our futures. But we also discovered that our different perspectives made us stronger as a team. By summer, we were turning a profit that exceeded anything the ranch had generated in Dad's final years. The combination of improved efficiency, better breeding programs, and oil royalties created a financial foundation that would support both our families for generations. More importantly, we were building something together, creating a legacy that honored Dad's memory while adapting to modern realities. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, we received a call that threatened to unravel everything we'd built. A lawyer from Houston contacted Henderson's office, claiming to represent someone with a legal interest in our father's estate. The caller identified himself as representing Elena Rodriguez, a woman who claimed to have been married to our father in a ceremony that predated our parents' marriage. If true, it would mean Dad had been a bigamist, and Elena might have legal claims to the ranch. Jake and I sat in Henderson's office, stunned by the implications. Our father had been the most honest man we'd ever known, a pillar of the community whose word was considered absolute truth. The idea that he'd hidden a previous marriage seemed impossible. "I've done some preliminary research," Henderson said, spreading documents across his desk. "Elena Rodriguez was indeed married to a man named William Thompson in 1975 in Laredo. The question is whether that man was your father." The evidence was circumstantial but troubling. The William Thompson on the marriage certificate was the right age, listed the right occupation, and had given an address in a town where Dad had worked briefly before moving to our county and meeting our mother. Elena's lawyer was demanding a DNA test and threatening to file a lawsuit that would freeze all assets until the matter was resolved. Even if her claims proved false, the legal battle could drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands in attorney fees. "What does she want?" Jake asked. Henderson consulted his notes. "Her lawyer claims she's not interested in money. She says she just wants to know the truth about her first husband, who disappeared from her life without explanation in 1976. The timing was significant. Dad had arrived in our county in early 1977, had met our mother that spring, and married her 6 months later. If he'd been fleeing a previous marriage, the timeline would fit." Jake and I left Henderson's office in silence, both of us struggling to reconcile this new information with everything we thought we knew about our father. We decided to investigate Elena's claims ourselves before involving lawyers in an expensive legal battle. Jake stayed to manage the ranch while I drove to Laredo, following a trail that was nearly 50 years old. The courthouse records confirmed the basic facts. Elena Rodriguez had married William Thompson on June 15, 1975, in a small ceremony witnessed by 2 friends. The marriage certificate listed his occupation as ranch hand and gave an address for a boarding house that no longer existed. Elena herself was 73 years old, living in a modest house near the border with her daughter and grandchildren. When I knocked on her door, she invited me in with the gracious hospitality that characterized her generation. "I've wondered about Billy for almost 50 years, she said, serving coffee in delicate china cups that seemed too fragile for her weathered hands. "He was a good man, worked hard, treated me with respect, but he was running from something, always looking over his shoulder." She showed me a photograph from their wedding day, a young man who looked remarkably like Jake, standing beside a beautiful young woman in a simple white dress. The resemblance was unmistakable, but something about the man's expression seemed different from the father I remembered. "He left one morning in February," Elena continued. "Said he had to go help a friend with some cattle, would be back in a few days. I never saw him again, never got a letter, a phone call, nothing." Her story was heartbreaking, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why had Dad left? What had he been running from? And why had he never mentioned this part of his past to Jake or me? Elena's daughter, Maria, had been researching the family history and had discovered our father's obituary online. The photograph accompanying the article had convinced them that William Thompson and our father were the same man. "We're not looking for money," Maria assured me. Mama just wants to know what happened, why he left, whether he ever thought about her. I promised to share what I learned and drove back home with more questions than answers. Back home, Jake and I searched through Dad's papers with new urgency, looking for any clue about his past. In a box of old documents stored in the barn, we found what we were looking for, and what we found changed everything. Hidden beneath decades of ranch records was a manila envelope containing newspaper clippings, legal documents, and a letter written in Dad's careful handwriting. The story they told was both tragic and heroic. In 1976, Dad had witnessed a murder in Laredo, a drug deal gone wrong that had left 2 men dead. He'd testified before a grand jury, providing evidence that led to the indictment of several members of a powerful smuggling organization. The letter explained that he'd been placed in witness protection, given a new identity, and relocated to our county for his safety. The marriage to Elena had been real, but it had been dissolved by federal authorities as part of his relocation. Elena had been told that her husband had died in an accident, a lie designed to protect both of them from retaliation. I never stopped loving her, Dad's letter concluded, but I couldn't risk her life by staying. The marshals said the only way to keep her safe was to disappear completely. I've carried that guilt for 40 years, but I've never regretted the choice. She deserved to live without fear. The letter went on to explain how he'd met our mother, how he'd built a new life while always looking over his shoulder, how he'd finally felt safe enough to stop running only in the last decade of his life. Jake and I sat in the barn, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented Dad's life's work, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd learned. Our father hadn't been a bigamist or a coward. He'd been a hero who'd sacrificed his own happiness to protect the woman he loved and to ensure that dangerous criminals faced justice. The final document in the envelope was a contact number for the U.S. Marshal Service, with instructions to call if anyone ever came looking for William Thompson. The conversation with the federal marshal confirmed everything Dad's letter had revealed. The case had been closed for decades, the criminals long dead or imprisoned, the threat that had forced Dad into hiding finally eliminated. With the marshal's permission, Jake and I returned to Laredo to share the truth with Eleanor. The meeting was emotional for everyone involved. Eleanor wept when she learned that her husband hadn't abandoned her, that he'd loved her enough to disappear rather than put her in danger. "He was a good man," she said, holding the photograph from their wedding day. "I always knew he was a good man." We arranged for Elena to visit the ranch, to see the life Dad had built, and to meet the family he'd created. She spent a week with us, sharing stories about the young man who'd become our father, helping us understand the courage and sacrifice that had shaped his character. The legal complications disappeared once the federal authorities confirmed Dad's identity and the circumstances of his relocation. Elena had no interest in challenging the will. She was simply grateful to finally know the truth about the man she'd loved and lost. As I write this, sitting on the same porch where Dad used to plan his days and watch his cattle, I'm amazed by the complexity of the legacy he left us. The ranch is thriving, the partnership between Jake and me stronger than either of us expected. The oil royalties provide security, but more importantly, we've learned to work together in ways that honor everything Dad taught us. Elena has become part of our extended family, a living link to the man our father was before he became the man we knew. Her presence has helped us understand that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to sacrifice everything for the safety of others. Thank you for listening to our story. Dad always said that land remembers everything, even when people forget. But sometimes the most important memories are the ones we carry in our hearts, the lessons that shape us long after the teacher is gone. I'd love to know where you're listening to this story from. Please share in the comments below and let us know what part of the world you call home. And if this story touched you the way it continues to touch our family, please consider subscribing to our channel. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to share, and more ways to honor the people who shaped us into who we are today.